MAS and the Robert S. Peabody for inviting me to speak, and thanks to all of you for spending some of your Wednesday afternoon with me. Gonna try to share my screen now. Are we good, Lindsay?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So today I am going to be talking about small stem tradition points and their use during the Woodland period in southern New England. This research, a lot of it was conducted while I was working on my master's thesis at the University of Connecticut. And this talk also includes some more recent work that I've done on this topic. Now, small stem points are probably the most common type of projectile point that is found in southern New England. And they have traditionally been considered to be diagnostic of the late Archaic period, about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. Although research over the last 35 years has established the presence of these points in some Woodland period context. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first thing I'd like to do is give just a very brief overview of the Woodland period, which is the time from about 3,000 years ago up until European contact about 500 years ago. And during this time, we see an increase in the focus on coastal resources. People are living around estuaries and developing salt marshes. And these very resource-rich and productive environments allow people to settle down before they adopt maize horticulture. By the end of the Woodland period, we see people living in the defined group territories that were observed by the European explorers in the 15 and 1600s. Another important aspect of the Woodland period is that we see broad exchange networks at this time, where items like stone raw material, finished tools, shells, and other goods, as well as people and ideas, are moving around the landscape. And it's important to remember that as people are settling down, they are maintaining connections with groups in other areas and regions. One of the major archaeological issues of the Woodland period concerns the continued use of small stem tradition points from the preceding late Archaic. And because these points were so common during the late Archaic period, they are often assigned a late Archaic age when they are found in absence of radiocarbon data that would indicate another period of occupation or diagnostic artifacts like ceramics. And this occurs despite these points having a long history of being reported as a minority point type in Woodland period contexts. Interestingly, when William Ritchie was originally defining the small stem point tradition and what he called the Squibnachet complex, he acknowledges that they're found in shell midden horizons that are securely dated to the late Woodland period. And this happens at the Hornblower 2 site on Martha's Vineyard, which is one of the type sites for the Squibnachet complex. However, he goes on to define the complex as a discrete Archaic period manifestation. And other researchers seem to have followed this lead, and they consider small stem points to represent a late Archaic component, even in some instances where they are found in association with Woodland period materials. And the problem with this is that the misclassification of these points may really be skewing our understanding of both the late Archaic and the Woodland periods. So to investigate these issues with small stem points, I'm really asking two pretty broad and simple questions. And that's, were small stem points used throughout the Woodland period? and what is the geographical distribution of small stem point use during this period? To investigate these issues, I am using data from the Laurel Beach 2 site in Milford, Connecticut. And this site was identified in 2018 during a cultural resource management survey that was associated with drainage improvements in the Laurel Beach neighborhood of Milford. And during that survey, we identified an intact shell midden within a portion of the drainage project impact zone. And this was later subjected to a site examination and a small data recovery program. This site consisted of a 20 to 25 centimeter thick shell midden that was comprised of soft shell clam, oyster, and quahog shells. The midden was capped by historical fill and underlain by natural B and C soil horizons. The image at the top right shows the site stratigraphy. You can see the two historical fill deposits. There's a modern fence or roadside sign post extending through those. Underneath the fill, there is a dense layer of marine shell and rich organic materials. That's the white speckled area there. And then this is underlain by your classic yellow-brown B and C horizon soils, which are found throughout New England. In all, about 30% of the shell midden as it existed within this impact zone was excavated. And I made some observations during the excavation, and those were that quartz cobble reduction and small stem points were prevalent both within the shell midden horizon and in the subsoil below it. Ceramics were also present in both soil packages, which led me to believe that they dated to the Woodland period. And red-brown chert flakes were also found in both soil packages. Moving on to the dating of the site, the phase 3 excavation had funding for one radiocarbon date. And I chose a hickory nut fragment in the vertical center of the shell midden to obtain a general age for this deposit. And surprisingly, this sample returned a conventional radiocarbon age of 895 plus or minus 15 years before present. This is a date that falls very securely within the late Woodland period. And this information ended up raising more questions than it answered. If we had one Woodland period date for the shell midden, did the entire deposit date to this period? Was it stratified? And if it really did date to the late Woodland, what were all those late archaic small stem points doing in there? So I obtained funding for two more radiocarbon dates from the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology in Connecticut. And for the first one, I chose another hickory nut fragment from the base of the shell midden. And the purpose of this was to date the bottom of the deposit and determine when it began to accumulate. Because I was still thinking about those small stem points, I made sure that this sample came from the same 50 centimeter quadrant and 5 centimeter level as one of those artifacts. This sample returned a date of 850 plus or minus 30 years before present. Again, a late Woodland date. And the error ranges on these dates overlap, and statistically they are considered to be the same date, meaning that they're essentially contemporaneous in time. And these data together confirm that the shell midden did date to the late Woodland period. For the third radiocarbon date, I chose a piece of hardwood charcoal that was found amongst the artifacts in the B horizon below the shell midden. And this sample was also from the same 50 centimeter quadrant and level as one of the quartz small stem points, and serve to date this artifact and also give a general age to the artifact assemblage from the B horizon soil. This sample returned a conventional radiocarbon age of 2110 plus or minus 30 BP. This date falls within the final centuries of the early Woodland period. And a Fox Creek point was also found in the B horizon, which indicates a middle woodland presence at the site as well. So seemingly I had a stratified site consisting of two Woodland period components. One of them dated to the early and or middle woodland, and then there was a shell midden that accumulated during the late Woodland period. Both soil packages had small stem points, evidence of quartz cobble reduction, ceramics, and red-brown chert flakes. And I thought that this was a really good opportunity to investigate changes in stone tool use through time, specifically related to the use of small stem points and the acquisition of chert raw material. So to interpret this site, I conducted separate analyses of the artifacts that were found within the shell midden and then those found within the subsoil below it. And then I compared the two. And the debitage, core, and biface analysis all yielded similar results. And this indicated that during both occupations, quartz was brought to the site as cobbles, and that all stages of small stem point production occurred on site. Chert, on the other hand, was brought to the site as finished bifaces or partially reduced flake blanks, and no diagnostic artifacts of this material were recovered, unfortunately. Importantly, this analysis, especially the core analysis, showed that there was a difference in the discard threshold between the quartz and chert artifacts on the site. And like I said, this is especially prevalent in the cores, where quartz cores were discarded after minimal and sometimes no modification. And there seems like quartz in general was readily discarded at the site, and there was no effort to recycle or use this material to its full potential. In contrast, most of the chert was heavily reworked and recycled. For example, the one chert core that is seen there, the photo on the right, and we're looking at the artifact on the bottom left, had been reduced to the point where it could no longer produce usable flakes. There were also two chert scrapers from the site that were heavily reworked and recycled. And the difference in curation between these two materials likely reflects a higher cost in obtaining the chert and suggests that this material was from a more distant source, which is something that I'll get back to in a moment. Moving on with the lithic analysis, a total of 10 projectile points were recovered from the Laurel Beach 2 site. 80% of these were small stem points, and they were recovered both within the shell midden and the subsoil horizons below it. The other non-small stem points that were recovered include a rhyolite cape stem point from the shell midden. This point is shown on the top image, second from the left. This point is generally poorly dated. The dates associated with it range between the late Archaic and the late Woodland period. So unfortunately, it does little to clarify the age of the midden or really aid in site interpretations. And the other non-small stem point that was recovered is the quartz Fox Creek point, which is shown on the bottom image, second from the right. Again, this is a middle Woodland period projectile point. The high percentage of small stem points in both assemblages indicates that they were an important part of the toolkit during both occupations of the site. The manufacturing traits and wear patterns on these points indicate that similar flint knapping strategies were used to produce them during both occupations, and the points from both soil packages exhibited rounded tips, asymmetric blades, and lateral snaps, which are all wear and use patterns that are consistent with being used as a knife. So it seems like during both occupations, people were using quartz cobbles to produce these small, narrow stemmed points, and then they were using them as some sort of knife or cutting implement. Getting back to the sources of this raw material, I figured the best place to start was the area right around the site. So I conducted a reconnaissance survey of the Housatonic River estuary, and about 3/4 of a mile to the southwest of the site, I found this very long gravel lens that had an ample supply of quartz cobbles that were of similar size and had similar cortex qualities to those that were recovered from the site. And a source like this could have easily been exploited on routine foraging trips around the estuary. And I feel like it is the most likely source for the quartz that was used at the Laurel Beach site. This reconnaissance survey unfortunately did not yield any chert artifacts. So to find the source of that raw material, I had to look a little further afield. And I found a likely candidate in what is called the Indian River chert from the Normanskill Formation in the central Hudson Valley. And I was able to obtain a bedrock sample of Indian River chert from Kingston, New York, which I have shown on the image on the right is the left flake there. And I compared this specimen to artifacts from Laurel Beach. I found that there was a very strong agreement in the composition, texture, and coloring between these samples. On the right there are flakes from Laurel Beach. These samples were then geochemically compared at UConn using XRF technology. And the results demonstrated that there were considerable similarities in the chemical composition of these two materials. However, they were not an exact match. There were a small number of other greenish gray and dark gray chert flakes recovered from Laurel Beach, which are visually similar to other Normanskill chert varieties, suggesting that there is a connection, or there was a connection, between the people living at Laurel Beach and the central Hudson Valley. When comparing the proportions of chert and quartz between the two occupations, I found that there was a statistically significant difference in the amount of chert recovered from the subsoil when compared to the shell midden. Chert was far more prevalent during the earlier occupations of the site. And this suggests that there was this change in the amount of chert suggests that there was either a change in mobility, trade relations, or some other disruption in access to chert raw material that occurred over the time of occupation of the Laurel Beach site. And by the late woodlands, people living at the site were relying almost exclusively on quartz cobbles for their raw material source. This reliance on quartz cobbles is one possible reason that small stem points continued to be used at that site during the late woodland. And this is a reflection of the assumption that there is a limited number of formal tools that can be produced from a quartz cobble. And that seems to be the only type of locally available tool stem. I put the Laurel Beach site into more of a regional context to get a sort of better idea of what was going on there. And to do this, I took evidence from Laurel Beach 2, and I compared it with other Woodland Period sites from across southern New England. I used a combination of published material and cultural resource management studies to do so. And I got to make a quick plug for CRM here. I'm a CRM guy, and I know that there's a lot of good archaeology that gets done under CRM contracts, but unfortunately, a lot of that information never reaches a wider audience. So I want to encourage people doing research in New England to seek out some of that CRM data. And I want to encourage people that work in CRM to make that available when it's appropriate. And that's my CRM plug. Anyway, getting back to the comparative analysis, the first thing I did in this was I compared Laurel Beach to other sites in coastal Connecticut. And I looked at sites in the lower Housatonic and the lower Connecticut River valleys. And I found some interesting patterns. In the lower Housatonic Valley, the percentage of Hudson Valley chert at these sites steadily increased through the early woodland, and the amount of chert peaked at some point during the middle woodland and then almost completely fell off, where by the late woodland, late woodland sites had almost no Hudson Valley chert. During the Iroquois pipeline survey, the researchers found numerous sites dated to the Woodland period based on ceramics and radiocarbon dates, but they found almost no Woodland period diagnostic projectile point types, and Levana points were especially curiously absent. And this led the researchers to hypothesize that small stem points were the everyday point style of the early and middle woodland populations in the Housatonic River Valley. In the lower Connecticut River Valley, Kevin McBride, during his dissertation work, also found a continued use of quartz cobble reduction and the use of small stem points from the late Archaic period through the end of the middle woodland. And after that, there was an influx in Hudson Valley chert and the use of Levana projectile points, which are a hallmark of the late woodland, became prominent. Interestingly, it appears that as the connections between the Housatonic and the Hudson Valleys waned during the middle woodland, which is reflected by the increase and then drop off in the amount of chert at these sites, the connections between the Connecticut Valley and the Hudson intensified. The chert seems to be showing up there as opposed to in the Housatonic. And although Levana points were very common at sites in the lower Connecticut River Valley, the use of small stem points during the late woodland was not entirely absent. When Lucy Lavin did a reanalysis of the old lime shell heap, she found that quartz cobble reduction and small stem points was associated with late woodland activity areas at that site. And perhaps what is the most compelling evidence from old lime is the inclusion of two wading river points and Sabonic phase ceramics in a burial. And that puts small stem points in a sealed and well-dated late woodland context at that site. Another really interesting thing that was going on in the Connecticut River Valley is that during the contact period, there seems to be a drastic decrease in the amount of non-local lithic material, namely the Hudson Valley chert. And at this time, there's a resurgence in quartz cobble technology and the production of narrow and stemmed points. And this resurgence of an old technology may have to do with the defined territories that we know that people were living in during the contact period and restricted access to other types of raw materials. Moving further to the east, there is suggestive evidence of the use of small stem points during the woodland period on Cape Cod. I'm just going to go through a few examples here. There was a single small stem point recovered from locus 10 of the Carn site in Eastham. And this site, otherwise entirely dated to the woodland period, was most intensely occupied during the middle woodland. In a similar example, a singular small stem point was recovered from the Mataquasan Purchase site in Chatham, which otherwise was entirely dated to the late woodland based on the artifacts there. And there was a single radiocarbon date of about 560 years ago from that site. In another example at the Rose site in Truro, which is a shell midden that was excavated in the 1950s, there is a clear association of small stem points with Middle Woodland Fox Creek phase artifacts, which is similar to what we had at the Laurel Beach 2 site. And my last example from Cape Cod is that 2 small stem points were recovered from the Fox Run 3 site on the Mid-Cape. And this site otherwise entirely dated to the Woodland period. The researchers there thought that these small stem points probably dated to the early Woodland period. And in their report, they cautioned that it would be unwise to attempt to define a late archaic occupation on the basis of these 2 points alone, which I thought was pretty cool. Collectively, this evidence suggests that small stem points were used in some capacity during the Woodland period on Cape Cod, but it's not entirely definitive. However, there is some evidence that's a little more clear from Martha's Vineyard, and this comes from the Gerhard site, which is a primarily late woodland and contact period site that was excavated by the Public Archaeology Laboratory in the late 1990s. And they found that small stem points dominated the chipstone tool assemblage at this site, and they comprised 87% of all the points that were typed. The most compelling evidence from that site comes from a cluster of 12 small stem points, or a concentration of points that was found in association with a cluster of post molds, one of which was dated to 420 plus or minus 60 BP. That date calibrates to between 1420 and 1640 AD, which is a terminal late woodland or contact period date. It's probably the best evidence from Eastern Massachusetts of small stem points use really late. So to conclude, I'd like to say that data from Laurel Beach and other sites indicates that small stem points were used in some capacity throughout the Woodland period, especially in coastal areas. And the persistence of small stem points may be related to reduced mobility at this time or changing exchange networks that limited access to higher quality raw material. And this left people to rely on locally available cobble sources for their tool stone, and many of these sources contain a high volume of quartz cobbles. The longevity of small stem points may be related to the assumption that there is a limited number of formal tool types that can be produced from a quartz cobble, and also their function as knives or gravers. And it seems that, like, in using small stem points as a knife or a cutting implement, they may be more along the lines of a tool class like a scraper, which is something that's seen as cross-cultural and is found associated with artifacts of many different stone tool traditions. And lastly, I'd like to say that considering that small stem points could essentially date from about 6,000 years ago to the historic period, I think my study and others others have done this too, bring the diagnostic value of these points into question. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that all small stem points date to the Woodland period, but I want to caution archaeologists working in New England against assigning the default late archaic age to this artifact class in absence of other data. So that's sort of my most important point of the day. And to wrap this up, I'd like to again say thank you to Lindsay, the MAS, and the RS Peabody for inviting me to speak. Thanks to all of these fine people on the screen for supporting this research. And I would be more than happy to take questions.
Yes, well, everyone, send me your questions. I think we have a few coming in already. But Dan, I'm going to start with one that's just sort of me. It's sort of similar to what I ask a lot of people. But
Sure.
what got you interested in lithics?
Oh boy.
You.
Well, for one, it's the most common artifact type that we find. So I got sort of well acquainted with it. I don't know. I mean, I dabble in flint napping. I like rocks, I guess. And I have a lot of them. And my fiance makes me keep them outside.
Oh,
I know.
The house.
There's a few important ones that are in the house, but for the most part, I have a rock garden.
Don't worry. I know a soil archaeologist who her husband makes her keep the stuff in the shed. So, you know, all the soil samples.
Yeah.
And I will say we have a couple of people here that are from the Milford area, so they're very excited about the Norman Skills stuff. And one of my good friends is actually from Milford too. So we have a question from Jerry. Does any of the recovered projectile points look like they have retooling, reuse, anything like that?
That is actually, the answer is yes. The Fox Creek point seems like it was resharpened repeatedly. The Cape Stemmed point is sort of the same. That one had been resharpened over and over again. That was one of the defining characteristics of that point. So usually not found outside of Eastern Massachusetts. Although doing the research, I found other places on Long Island Sound that these points had been recovered. And some of the small stem points, again, had been resharpened, particularly on one side of the blade, which is an indication that it was hafted and used as a knife or a cutting implement as opposed to a projectile.
Okay, sort of following up with that, we have another question from Marty Dudek. Have any of them been utilized as reamers, drills? They've seen this on a couple different sites, so was just wondering if any of them were that.
I have seen that elsewhere. I don't think any of the ones from this site were used in that fashion.
Okay. Again, everyone, don't forget to type your questions. I have a couple people raising your hands, but add it into the chat down at the bottom or to the side. Any other questions? This was really good, Dan.
Oh, thank you.
Thorough. Any signs of bipolar reduction or unfinished pieces?
Yes. There was evidence of both. Some of the quartz cobbles that were recovered were split, suggesting bipolar reduction. Others, it seemed like the flakes were, I guess, knocked off the edges, for lack of a better term. What's really interesting is we had quartz cobbles that were completely unmodified, which we collected as artifacts because all of the natural stone in this area was a really angular, sort of green-gray, schisty stuff. And we thought that these quartz cobbles contrasted greatly like that and were probably brought to the site. So we had unmodified quartz cobbles. We had some where there was just a few flakes removed or the cobble was split in half. And we had others that were fully reduced into bifaces, where it seemed like the center of the cobble was the biface, and a few of those had bases that were beginning to be napped on them, suggesting that they were going to be made into small stem points.
Okay. We have another question from Kevin. Did your regional analysis suggest any temporally diagnostic variation within the range of small stem points that would suggest any value to the typological divisions made between Squibnaucket, Wading River, etc.? Or do they suggest typological divisions seem more like resharpening stages in a general small stem production approach?
I guess a little bit of both. The points at this site, some of them were assigned just a general small stem type. We had one Squibnaucket stemmed and at least one Wading River. And the Squibnaucket stemmed was found in, I can't remember now. I want to say it was in the shell midden, which was sort of surprising because I think that's one that people say is definitively late archaic. Sorry, the phone's ringing. I hope it wasn't important. You just hung up on them. Yeah, exactly. I mean, in my opinion, I think that I'm not a fan of the seriation of small stem point types. I think they're all pretty contemporaneous. I don't know if it is from resharpening because a lot of it is that the basal attributes are different. But there's been so many sites that I've worked on where it seems like we get the whole range of them in a single context. And my gut feeling is that the seriation is not not based in reality.
Okay. We have one last question from Megan. Were these points shared among different tribes or specific to the region?
That's a great question. These points are sort of most prominent in New England. And at that time you have, many different tribal groups living here. I think that these were probably cross-cultural and not associated with a distinct group of people.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was so fascinating and everything. And thank you to all our viewers. So we are looking forward to you joining us for our next episode, episode 6, which will be on April 7th. And we will be joined by Elizabeth Tarlis, who will be talking about trade and smuggling in Plymouth Colony. So yeah, we are excited to have you guys, and we look forward to you guys signing up for our next one. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again, Dan.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody.